Chapter 32. Gwendraeth James walked into the interview room carrying 2 cups of coffee. He put one on the green-topped desk next to Harry Warden, who was leaning back in his metal chair. He pushed the other across the table to where Samantha Merriam was sitting. She didn't even look up at him. "So exactly were you responsible for the death of your father?" he said, without preamble. He knew that the machine was still running, and that all the routine cautions had been gone through before he'd left the room. She didn't say anything for a while. She just sat there in the metal chair that matched the ones they sat in, like a pale, spectral emanation of her former self. Gwendraeth couldn't help remembering her former vivacity, especially the first day he'd questioned her, when she had been cutting wood with David Young on the path above Place Wenlas. Then she had been lively, determined enough to carve out a life for herself, despite the obvious difficulties of her relationship with her father. Now it was as if her physical presence lacked density. She sat there slumped forward, her frizzed hair falling over her face. She was wearing a navy blue jumper and black jeans. It didn't look good together, and she obviously didn't care. "Well?" Minutes seemed to pass in the small room. Gwendraeth thought about how complicated things had become ever since yesterday. Earlier in the morning, before his appointment with Fionn Roberts, news had come through that there were traces of Queenie Rogers' hair and blood in the back of Marion Keynes' blue Volvo, the one that Queenie had borrowed on the night she'd been murdered. That confirmed what he and Harry Warden had suspected. Queenie Rogers had been murdered somewhere else, and her body driven back to Place Wenlas in a deliberate attempt to stage a copycat murder. That had been one new development. Now there was this. Samantha Merriam lifted her head and said, "I met my father on the track. I was on my way to see him at Tretheg Rectory because he said he was going to cut my brother and me out of his will. I was going to try and persuade him not to." "How were you going to do that?" Harry Warden sipped his coffee when he finished speaking. "I didn't know exactly. I hadn't worked out all the details. I tried to speak to him on the phone the night before, but he wouldn't even listen. So I decided to go and see him, to try and change his mind. I was walking down the track to the rectory early that morning when I saw him coming towards me driving a car that I didn't know. He was coming slowly enough to recognize me, but it didn't seem like he was going to stop. I stood on the track and waved my arms, but he kept on coming. He tried to go around me and I moved towards him. Then he tried to go the other way and I followed him there. It was like a mad, slow dance, and it ended with him tipping the car over the edge and into the gully. When I looked over the edge, I saw that he wasn't moving. I knew he was dead. So I had to leave him there. I had to leave my own father in the ditch in the middle of nowhere." "You could have gone to the rectory for help," Harry Warden suggested. What was I going to say? Help me? I've killed my father? I decided to leave things as they were. I went back to the main road. I got a lift into town. Then I got the morning bus back to Place Wenlas. It stops at the end of the drive. "Who gave you the lift?" "I don't know. Some people from Rochester. They were passing through on the way to Maisebont. They didn't know the place well." "And where did they drop you off exactly?" "In Maisebont, near the edge of town, not far from the bus station." "How did you know your father was dead if you didn't go down to the car?" Gwendraeth looked for any telltale expression on Samantha Merriam's face. There was no obvious clue that she was lying, but he didn't much like her story. There was blood all over his face. He wasn't moving. What else was I to conclude? It was an odd choice of words in the circumstances, Gwendraeth thought, revealing the possibility of a rehearsed account. Still, over 2 weeks had now passed since the discovery of the body. She'd had plenty of opportunity to rehearse her statement, if necessary. You loved him, didn't you? So why did you leave him? The last was a good question, Gwendraeth thought. Harry Warden always did better after a shot of caffeine. I don't know exactly. I was afraid that I would spend years in prison because of it. I didn't want that, so I went back to Place Win-Las, and I didn't say anything to anyone. So what changed your mind? Gwendraeth James said. What made you come forward last night after all this time? I loved my father, though I'm not sure he appreciated it. I loved Queenie. When I saw her lying on the floor of the drawing room with her head bashed in, I think I must have gone a bit funny. I couldn't take any more. So you went to see your brother? Samantha Merriam nodded, and for the first time she seemed to notice the cup of coffee in front of her. She nodded at Gwendraeth and took a sip. She looked pale and worn. Why didn't you go and see Martin James? It was a question that had to be asked, and he was extremely interested in her reaction. She looked at him questioningly over her cup of coffee. We know you were lovers, Gwendraeth continued. We interrupted you in the Apple House that afternoon. It's none of your business. Murder makes it my business. You know that as well as I do. That doesn't mean I have to talk to you about my relationship with Martin. So it is a relationship, Harry Warden cut in. It's a good question, Gwendraeth thought. You just said you found us. Samantha Merriam wasn't giving anything away and didn't look at either of them. So why did you go to your brother's then? I love my brother. I needed to see him. But you don't love Martin James? It's a tricky question, Gwendraeth knew. Even as he asked, he was unsure of her exact response. Even if I did, I wouldn't tell you. It was a stalemate, Gwendraeth realized. He was not inclined to accept Samantha Merriam's account of what had happened at face value. And yet, for the moment, that was all he had. Motioning to Harry Warden, he formally ended the interview and made arrangements for Samantha Merriam to be taken back to her cell. You don't like it, do you? Harry Warden said in the lift on the way back to the office. Gwendraeth James shook his head. Do you? I would have said she had a lot going for her the first time we met. Not like today. The lift reached their floor and they got out. They walked towards the office together. Chief Superintendent Harding was waiting for them by the door. So there's progress, Gwendraeth? If you say so, sir. What do you mean, if I say so? I hear she's confessed. Hasn't she? Gwendraeth James looked at Harding, who seemed to be concentrating too hard. It's a question of whether we believe the confession. And do you? He waited a while before he spoke. Then Gwendraeth said, Frankly, I feel that quite a lot of it is dubious. Harding concentrated some more. You know I expect you to get to the bottom of this, don't you? Of course. Well then, don't let your intuition get in the way of a solution. And with that, Chief Superintendent Harding made his way back down the corridor. When they'd returned to the office, Gwendraeth James said to Harry Warden, I want you to get hold of Anne Davis. I want you to ask her what happened to the baby her mother had with Wyndham Spencer James. I want to know who adopted it. Harry Warden looked surprised. touched his gelled head and he said, "Where did all this come from, Chief?" "My intuition. Where else?" "I mean, really." "Bottom of my file drawer, under the label called Red Herring." Harry Warden looked thoughtful for a moment and then said, "Harding's really got to you, hasn't he?" "It's not Harding. It's this bloody case." Harry Warden sat down at his desk. "And what are you going to be doing while I'm doing all this? If I may be so bold as to ask." "I'm going to talk to Jane Merriam." "What about?" "Her children." And with that, Gwendraeth James left the office and slammed the door. The fluorescent light in the waiting room cast a chill, greenish pallor over the faces of Jane Merriam, Marion Keynes, and Martin James. The latter stood with his hands in his pockets by the window that overlooked the car park. The two friends, dressed in contrasting styles, Jane Merriam in a well-cut coat of cool grey with matching boots, and Marion Keynes in a green tweed jacket and jeans, were nevertheless joined by a bond of more than close proximity. There seemed to be a kind of tacit agreement between them, Gwendraeth thought immediately as he entered the room, and that probably included their opinion of him. "Well, Inspector?" It was Marion Keynes who spoke first. It was as if she was anxious to control the relatively small space which was littered with the usual unreadable magazines. "I'd like to speak to you alone," Gwendraeth said. "Jane Merriam, if you don't mind." "I think I do mind," Jane Merriam said, "given the circumstances. If I understand correctly, my daughter has confessed to killing my ex-husband. I think it's only reasonable that I might need the support of my oldest friend." She indicated Marion Keynes. "And after all, as I think you know, Martin has been involved with Samantha." "That's precisely why I don't want him present," Gwendraeth said. He didn't even look at Martin James. "I'm here. I'm not invisible," Martin James said from the corner of the room. "It's only a few days since you barged into the Apple House and couldn't wait to interrogate me. What's happened, Gwendraeth? Feeling the pressure?" The words hit home, despite the fact that Martin James couldn't possibly know what was happening, Gwendraeth thought. He certainly couldn't know anything about the interaction that had taken place between himself and Chief Superintendent Harding. "If you don't mind," Gwendraeth insisted, speaking directly to Jane Merriam once more, "and even if you do." Both Martin James and Marion Keynes stood their ground for a moment, and then the latter gave a slight nod and moved towards the door. Martin James soon followed. "Don't let him bully you," he said to Jane Merriam on his way out. The woman in front of him had an attractive, collected quality that Gwendraeth had noted before. Jane Merriam now sat upright before him, her hands resting easily on her knees. Her well-cut slacks and jacket reinforced the sense of casual elegance and a self-possession that would be enviable were it not for the fact he wanted to get something out of her. Something she might not be prepared to tell him. "When you took Samantha to the station," he began. "The day before yesterday." "I think you'll find it was yesterday, Inspector, if you check." She was right, Gwendraeth had to admit. So much seemed to have happened in a relatively short space of time that a kind of compression had occurred. He steadied himself to try not to let his mistake affect his judgment. "Yes," he said, as calmly as he could. "But why did she need to see her brother so urgently?" "I don't know. She didn't say." "But you took her to the station, nevertheless." "She's my daughter." There was a pause while Gwendraeth considered this. Jane Merriam then spoke again. "There's been a murder, Inspector, if you remember. I thought getting away might do her some good, despite my advice that everybody should stay near enough to remain in touch." "Yes." "Can you explain that, please?" I don't see that I need to, actually. How you conduct an investigation is your business, and how I decide to look after my own daughter is mine. There was no indication of any chink in Jane Merriam's well-ordered defences, Gwendraeth thought. If anything, she seemed more collected now than on the first occasion he'd met her. He decided to try a different tack, to deliberately get under her skin. "Isn't it unusual for a woman in trouble to run to her brother?" he said. "Perhaps. But then, you see, they have always been close. And he isn't her brother by blood." "He's adopted?" "I've been through this once today," Jane Merriam explained. "Samantha's the adopted one. You only have to look at her and then at me. It seems obvious. Is she sleeping with him as well as with Martin James?" It was a long shot, Gwendraeth thought, but one that seemed intuitively right. She didn't rise to his provocation. "Two people are dead, aren't they?" Jane Merriam said. "Both of them were close to Samantha. Isn't that more important than whom she happens to be sleeping with?" "I don't think you're as neutral about this as you pretend," Gwendraeth said, noticing that Jane Merriam was opening and closing her right hand involuntarily. He took it for a sign of stress. He pressed forward with his questioning. "Are you? If I admitted that I was disturbed, what then?" "Then you're disturbed." "And?" "Somewhere you might be able to provide fresh insight into Samantha's story." "Which is?" "She says she went to see her father to try and make him change his mind about his will. She says she talked to him on the phone the night before, but he was adamant. She went to see him, she says. She met him driving Paul James's car on the track above Tretheig Rectory. In her own words, a kind of slow dance took place in which she tried to stop the car and Parker Merriam tried to continue on his journey. Neither of them would give way, so he accidentally drove the car over the edge of the gully. What's wrong with that?" "Nothing's wrong with it. It's a perfectly plausible account. Except for the fact that I don't believe it." "Perhaps that's your problem." Jane Merriam seemed to have maintained her equilibrium, Gwendraeth noticed. He tried again. "Your daughter doesn't really care about money, does she?" "Everyone cares about money." "She went to live in Plaswen Las, in a Buddhist retreat. Money is hardly high up on her list of priorities, is it?" "Is it?" "Perhaps not." "Not like it is on yours, or your son's." Jane Merriam straightened herself in a chair. "What are you suggesting, Inspector?" "I'm suggesting that your daughter Samantha is not telling the truth, that she might be protecting someone." "Then might I suggest you're possibly wrong?" It was a direct refutation and one which restored a measure of coolness to the conversation, Gwendraeth knew. But he wouldn't give in. "Question is," he said, "who is Samantha shielding?" "I've told you what I think," Jane Merriam said. "Can I go now?" Gwendraeth James nodded in reply and went back out to the corridor, where Martin James and Marion Keynes were still waiting. He walked past them without acknowledgement. By the time Gwendraeth got back to his office, it was 2:30, and Harry Warden was no longer there. He must have gone for a late lunch, Gwendraeth thought. He might as well do the same himself. When he reached into the pocket of his suit jacket for his car keys, something fell out. A small, rectangular photograph of a black-haired schoolboy from St. Illtyd's. Wyndham Spencer James. Bugger him, Gwendraeth thought. Bugger them all. The James family, and Plaswen Las, and the 2 murders they had occasioned. When he'd finished cursing, he put the photograph back on his desk, and then he went out to lunch.